So if folks have ever shared space with me before, you know I don't do a podium very well. I like to move about and be with the folks with whom I am engaging. I'm super excited to be here. I consider myself a friend of Towson University, as I have worked with a number of faculty and staff in the room on your intergroup dialogue class. I imagine that I have seen a couple folks at some conferences, and so this feels a little bit like a homecoming for me. I'm also a proud graduate of University of Maryland, College Park, and call Baltimore my home. I was born and raised there. So the idea of courageous conversations in this context matters to me. It matters to me because I grew up here. It matters to me because I have had my training in the higher education space. And it matters to me because I believe that it's through these conversations that we actually do create more inclusive environments. If we all had the ability to voice our needs, be heard and understood, indicate how we would like to maneuver in space, it's likely that we would feel more included. And so my talk today is going to help us do some of the framing. Your concurrent sessions are going to enable you to dive into some of the more specifics, whether it be in the classroom, a departmental meeting. Right? But this morning, I'm asking that you put your thinking caps on for some of the framing. Now, I know that we're at about 9, 10 or so on a Friday morning. Some of you don't make it to campus until 10 on a Friday, right? So we're nice and early, and it's my goal to keep energy high, keep engagement high. My ask is that you mirror that. Right? So whatever it is that you need to do to have yourself here, fully here, that's like mind, not just body, emotions as well. Sometimes, you can be at the table, but you really like on your phone outside in the hallway, right? I want you to get here. And to get here, I want you to answer this question for yourself. Why are you here? I want to give us a moment to set some intentions. So I want you to reflect to yourself, why are you here? What brought you? Leah shared with me that some folks were calling like, can I come? I know I haven't registered. Can I be there? Folks had some energy in coming to this space. So take a moment and think to yourself, why are you here? Try to generate both a head and a heart answer. Show of hands. How many folks are like, I'm here because I've kind of messed up a conversation like this in the past? Anybody? Okay, all right. Got some honest folks out here, right? What about, these are just skills that I think I need to learn. Show of hands there. Like, I'm here because I want some skills. Okay. How about there's just a lot happening in the world right now. I just feel like I need this. Like, I turn on the news, I'm like, I just need this. Whatever you're about to give me, please, bring it on. I feel like I need it. Okay. Want to facilitate better conversations with students? Got some folks there? Last one. I'm not sure why I'm here, but I'm glad to be here, right? Might not be certain, but okay, right? Got at least one. I'm not sure, but I'm just glad to be here. Whatever reason that you're here, I am also glad that you're here. I am hopeful from this talk you take at least one nugget, possibly from the entire day, that you take several that will be helpful for you as you are engaging in these conversations. So let me frame today's talk a bit for you. First off, I want to focus on your process and your context. So I'm not giving you the play-by-play on how to have these conversations, but I am wanting to focus on what's up with you as you enter the conversation. Additionally, this idea of context. We are often entering these conversations very quickly and don't hold a lot of space or room for for what's up. Also, I want to focus on or frame this around what actually makes these conversations challenging. Like, we all know that they're challenging, but we often don't actually pick apart why it's challenging. Right? And in so doing, having some clarity on why it's challenging, I think can have us better skilled and better equipped to enter the conversation. That's the slide. That was not on my computer. It's supposed to be a second line there. These conversations are about difference. Dr. Cox mentioned this in the introduction of today, right? So I want to be very clear that the kind of conversation we're talking about is the kind of conversation where race and sexual orientation and gender expression and religion, where that is the substance of it. So we're not necessarily having a courageous conversation about the weather. I mean, we could debate it if we wanted to, because it's been really hot and then it's going to get cold. And I don't know, I'm fearful to talk about that because I don't know how you feel. No, that's not it. Right? That's not it. We are actually talking about the stuff that makes us move in our bodies, generally connected to how we are different. Right? Which means that the other piece of the framing is that these are conversations that occur across difference. Right? Usually we're able to find commonality and simple solutions when conversations are happening with people that are similar to ourselves. But what makes it courageous is the idea that we're doing this across difference. And in today's world and time, this is particularly important because we live more homogeneously than ever before. Right? As a matter of fact, for many of us in the room right now, this is as diverse as your weekend will be. Real talk, right? Like looking around right now, your weekend, if it starts on Friday, this is about as diverse as it's going to get. You're going to go home to a home community, and people are likely going to look like you, sound like you, think like you, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. However, it doesn't provide us an opportunity to practice what it means to engage across difference. We all have the opportunity to choose to live our lives and be in spaces that make us feel good, and we do that with some intention. And if we are only talking with, engaging folks that look and think like us, then how are we supposed to do it when we actually are with someone that's different? Right? That's also a part of the framing for today's talk. So let us start with this courageous part. Right? Now, like any good keynote, I said, all right, well, let's look up the word, courage. What do we got there? The quality of mind or spirit that enables a person to face difficulty, danger, pain, etc., without fear, some bravery. I was like, oh, okay, so we're really talking about the lion from the Wizard of Oz, who needed some courage to move about, right? The cowardly lion. I was like, well, what is it that we're fearing? And what are other emotions coming along with it? I think fear is one of them. I think there's some more. Which emotions do you feel when having a courageous conversation? I got a long list up there for you. Take a look. Pick a few out. Got them? Got them in your mind? So my guess is that those are likely the words, some of them, that you picked. Am I right? Can I get a mm-hmm or yes or something? Am I right? Yes. Right. We enter these conversations often with negative emotions. Our actual association with the conversation that we have to have often is less than positive. But emotions are the thing that line the path on which we build a connection, a conversation, or conflict. Put differently, you are setting yourself up for good, for bad, for indifferent, with the emotions that you have at the outset of that conversation. So what might it mean for us to choose a reframe on our emotions when we're entering a courageous conversation? What would it mean to say, I'm going to enter this in the state of possibility and feel positive about what could happen? I'm going to enter this neutral and open, anticipating that it can go in a variety of directions. Or, I feel anxious to have this conversation. I'm going to do a pre-conversation to feel better. I'm going to call my faculty colleague. I'm going to call a friend and say, I know this is the conversation I have to have. I also know that I feel really anxious about it, and I would like to feel better than anxious before I get into it. So here, the whole idea is that before we get in, let's get clear on how we're feeling. Let's name how we're feeling. Let's be in touch with how we're feeling. Now, some of you are saying, that's a lot of feeling for work. Right? I don't do all that feeling at work, Domonic. Right? You say that you don't, but you do. And I assure you that every single one of these conversations that you have had or that you're going to have, you have a set of emotions and feelings before entering it. There's no choice in the matter. This is the stuff that pulls at the heartstrings. And if that is true, then you also have an opportunity to get clear on what those emotions are and possibly reframe or reshape before going. You might not change them completely, but you most certainly can entertain what they are and then move in a space to shift. Emotions are a part of the context in which we are entering these conversations. I want to deepen this idea of context. And as I do this work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, I am often drilling on this idea of context and content. The image up on the screen is that of a glass with some water in it, right? The glass itself is the context, the water is the content. And my push for folks is that we put context before content. That we actually have a way to think about what's happening in either my small context or a large context that would shape and matter to the content of a conversation. I'll give you an example that is up for me right now. As was mentioned, I work at the Ed School at Harvard. And this coming week, we're going to have an Ask With Forum. It's a program that we do a couple times throughout the semester. It's a panel, speakers, et cetera. And at this particular one, we are going to have a donor there. And that donor gave money, but then also gave a rare American flag. And at this Ask With Forum, as a part of the introduction, we are thanking this donor, and we are also indicating this flag. If anybody has turned on the news recently, there is some stuff up around flags and anthems and our values. So had we had this Ask With Forum yesterday, last week, a month ago, a year ago, we may not solicit or get the same reactions that we're likely going to get as we take time out of a major program to recognize a donor and a flag. Context, content. Now, for you all here, I imagine there's some things up in your context, right? So student demands, maybe they have quelled some, but that has been up and has stirred things for us. I mean, my guess is that the space we're in right now could be connected, aligned, tied to some student demands at some point, right? Possibly you're new. You might be a new staff member here, so you're like, well, my context is that all this is brand new. Or maybe it's your first year as a professor here. Newness is a big thing shaping our context. Let's not forget the historical legacy of whatever. It could be sexism, homophobia, racism, xenophobia, but that is in our space, that's in our air. Okay. Race and other social identities just in the news and media. So folks are consuming these kinds of conversations in their context, even when they're not talking one-on-one because of how much is up. Free and hate speech debates on campuses. Right? So whatever conversation I'm going to have in the backdrop is this larger debate that's going on. Newer leadership team here at the institution, right? I know that your president is newer. I know that Leah is newer, right? That's mattering and shaping how we might be engaging. And then finally, just a new academic year, right? Okay. All these things matter, right, in how we might be going into the conversation. I would like to get your voices in on this. Okay? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time, before we spend time, I'm going to deepen this idea. Got ahead of myself. So I said that the glass is the context, and it holds the water. There are a lot of things that hold water. Right? Can your context hold the content? Can it hold the conversation? Is your context a 5-gallon jug? Is it a canteen? Is it a tea kettle for a really hot conversation? Is it a reservoir for a really large conversation, right? So sometimes we're trying to have conversations or engage content in a context that may or may not be able to hold it. Right? Sometimes we have to develop the context to take on the content. Faculty actually know this best. You don't have your most deep conversation in the classroom on day one, do you? Do you? No. You do something over the course to develop that context, to develop that container, so that later on you can have different conversations, more profound ones, deeper ones where folks are doing more sharing, right? So this idea isn't new. However, it's often not the idea that's engaged to really think about the relationship between our context and our content. Now, the part where I stop talking for a little bit and get your voices in. You've had a chance to warm up your thinking, and now you get a chance to share. Right? And the question that I'm asking you is, how has your current context shaped or impacted how you engage or have courageous conversations at Towson? And keep in mind that these courageous conversations are about difference, and they are across difference. Okay? So I'm going to ask that you speak with a neighbor at your table, and we'll spend a solid 5 minutes here. And the thinking is, how has this space and your own current context, right? So it doesn't have to be just what's happening for you at Towson. Your context moves, right? How you're feeling in the world. How has that impacted how you're having these conversations? Please turn and talk to a neighbor. I mentioned that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on what makes these conversations hard. We've already talked about the emotions and the feelings. I entered with that. Second up is social identity dynamics, the bumps that actually come along with the social identities that we have is something that makes these conversations hard. Our focus on intentions. In these conversations, often there's not shared language, right, or common language. Sometimes we don't have a goal or outcome, and that can make it really difficult. Right? We get into the conversation, and we're like, we have no idea where we're going. Right? Why are we in it? What's supposed to be happening on the other side? And I should say, sometimes the actual goal is to be in the conversation. So for folks who are always like, well, I need to know exactly what we're doing, what you're doing is what you're doing, right? That you can be practicing. Right? Sometimes that is, in fact, the goal. And the other idea here is that participants become triggered, right? And so things are said in the conversation that ultimately take you out of the conversation because of what's said. We've done the emotions and feelings, and where I'm going to spend the rest of my time as a part of this talk is on social identity dynamics and the focus on intentions. I would implore you that as you think about these conversations, to think about the other three and maybe figure out some ways that you can do some learning in those spaces. So how do our social identities matter in courageous conversations? Right? In the framing, I said that these conversations are about difference and across difference. So that has to mean that our social identities matter. Now, you might be asking again, social identities, let's bring back the classic social identity wheel, right? So we're talking about race, we're talking about religion, we're talking about ability, right? Sexual orientation, social economic class status, right? Just to make sure we're on the same page here, right? And I have 3 ideas on how they might matter. That the conversation is actually about a social identity of a participant, that the engagement in stereotype, right, comes up in these conversations, and that sometimes it requires one to learn about a social identity that is not their own. Now, you could list off a lot of other ways that social identities matter, but as I've been in this space, I keep coming back to these. And I'll try to give you an example of each one. So also at work recently, I had a colleague share with me that their unit or department is changing the site for their day of service. And a day of service is, I think, fairly standard in higher ed. It's a way to sort of bring together a team or a unit or students to go do some service in your local community. And they used to have a site that was relatively, I think, secular, like it didn't have any sort of religious affiliation. And they're changing to a site that I think is called something like Christmas for the Homeless. Okay? And so we are in an email exchange, and my colleague is saying to me, like, how am I supposed to have this conversation? I identify as Jewish. And I understand that we've sort of secularized Christmas, and yet I don't feel comfortable. I think that this site still evokes Christianity. Right? So to get in that conversation, we are also then talking about what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be Jewish working in that unit, working in that department, when a decision is made, a decision that didn't necessarily include the voices of some staff, it sounds like, not sure yet, but when a decision is made to do service at a site that is connected to Christmas. Right? So it's hard to avoid the, like, this is about me, but this is about this thing over there, but it's also about me. Right? The example I would use for myself right now, we're talking a lot about St. Louis. We have been for some time. There are protests that are happening, right? We recently had another police officer acquitted, right? And who's protesting? There are a lot of black folk protesting. So if we're going to talk about the protests, that means that we're talking about black people. That means we're talking about me. Right? Now, you didn't say that you were talking about me. I am not in St. Louis. I ain't been there recently. But it's hard for me not to feel like you're talking about me. So this idea that the conversation is about a social identity, and that social identity is occupied by a person in that space. The second one, fearing engaging a stereotype. I'll use myself as an example because I can get passionate. You probably already have seen that, right? You probably are feeling that. And a stereotype that's associated with black men and passion is that of anger. Right? If I'm having a courageous conversation, ones where emotions are already involved, we decided that, it's likely that I might become impassioned, and in that same space and time, I may engage a stereotype that exists. I am traversing that as a participant in the conversation that is mattering to me. I could go in a different direction on the axis of gender or sex assigned at birth, right? And an expectation that women might be meek or mild in a conversation. Right? So if a woman becomes, somebody laugh like, yeah, the hell with that. A woman's identity gets implicated in the stereotype, right, or generalization, or even an expectation. I mean, whatever you want to call it, right, that there's not necessarily freedom to move about in the conversation authentically because of expectations, assumptions, and stereotypes. And this last one, that the conversation requires one to learn about a social identity, not their own, I'm finding this come up a lot as we have conversations about gender pronouns. Right? Now, let's be clear that any human being can participate in a gender pronoun conversation, but that we entered the gender pronoun conversation in trying to better recognize and be inclusive of folks that are gender nonconforming, okay? And so when we are having that conversation, it's about social identity because lots of us did not know what it meant to use a pronoun. Some of us were asking, what is a pronoun? And I'm like, well, that's an elementary school lesson, right? You know what a pronoun is, right? But what's its relevance to an introduction, to being in space, right? And so it might not be the thing that affects you in the social identities that you have, but it's certainly learning about another social identity that may or may not be represented in the conversation. You know, there's a very real dynamic as an aside that happens when two people are having this courageous conversation, and you can tell that it's not one of their identities because you're talking about they over there as if they don't exist. I find this a lot happening often with Muslim-identified folk, and particularly when we start getting into the prayer space conversation on campuses. It's like, well, they need a room, right? Well, who's the they? Muslim-identified folk, people of faith, right? Can we name the identity that we're talking about? And can we not talk about it necessarily like it's way over there and not a part of the conversation, a part of what's represented here, a part of how I might be connected? I might not show up as Muslim. However, I might have family members that are, right? And it can still matter to me. Larger dynamics that exist. Okay. If you've engaged in this work at all, you probably have seen a slide similar to this. And the notion is that marginalized and minoritized folk can often be focusing on one part of the conversation in a dynamic that's happening, whereas folks with some privilege are focusing on something else. Intent and impact is one, but I'm going to get into that a little bit later. Patterns and individual acts, right? Systems culture, okay? How far we need to go, how far we've come. I'll just give you one example, right? And the example connects to patterns and individual acts. When we start having the conversation about police killings of unarmed people of color, particularly black men, sometimes what I hear is, well, that one time. I don't hear it as much anymore because where we're at in 2017, way too many data points. But a while ago, I would hear that one time. And I will often hear that from dominant identified and or white people. Right? People of color and black folk, I would hear saying, no, patterns. This has been happening, right, for a very long time. Need I insert lynching from back in the day, right? We can historicize this. Right? If this is the dynamic coming up, we get bumps. Because we are literally looking at the same issue differently. Our opportunity is to flex a muscle to say, I might be looking at how far we've come. What would it mean for me to look at how far we need to go? I hear myself advocating for just this one, but it sounds like there could be more here. And on the other side, like, oh, I see the pattern, and I also can hear that you're focusing on the one. Let me honor that you're focusing on the one, and see how I can bridge you to the pattern, right? As opposed to staying on either side. So, you all get to speak again. You're like, we got to talk again? You do. And I want you to think about a social identity that you have that matters to you in courageous conversations. It could be your sex assigned at birth. It could be your gender. It could be your religion. It could be your sexual orientation. I want you to get a social identity up in you that matters when you have these conversations. Okay? And I want you to return to the person you were talking about, and you have a couple options on where to go. You won't get to all three questions in the time that we have. But use these questions as a way to get into a quick conversation. So as a, right, is it as a woman? Is it as a white person? Is it as a Christian? As a person with a disability? As a gay person, whatever your social identity is, you're choosing. What does it feel like? What's your tendency? What's your strategy? What's your approach? Right? We'll spend about 5 minutes here, and I want you to return to the person that you were already speaking with when you had the context conversation. Disentangling intent from impact. I said that another challenge is we focus a lot on intentions. It sounds like, that's not what I intended to do. I didn't mean that. I said that, but that wasn't really it. That's usually what it sounds like in the conversations. And what happens is there's a hold off. So I'm supposed to just hold all of your intent. Right? I'm supposed to just take that all in and be like, okay, so how I'm feeling doesn't matter. Okay? Because you have cleared the air with your intention. You have said that's not what you intended to do. So therefore, me feeling like very sticky and icky because you said that you don't like black people protesting in St. Louis, and I feel some type of way about that, right? I'm just supposed to like sit in that. Okay? No, right? We have to give more weight to impact. Right? Okay. We have to give more weight to impact. What's up on the screen there is this idea of what we are usually aware of in these conversations, your intentions and others people impact. Like you're really clear on what you're doing, and then you're really clear on what's happening to you. Right? But you have no idea on what's happening on the other side. And I joke with folks, I'm like, but how clear are you on your intentions? Right? I mean, do you wake up in the morning and say, today I intend to be a really positive person? Right? Some of you might. I try it some mornings. Rainy Friday mornings is when I say, I'm going to be really positive today. Right? So sometimes we don't even know our intentions, and yet we lean on them inadvertently when we get to that bump in the conversation. We run to our intentions. We run to what we thought that we intended to do instead of running to impact. And when we run to impact, we actually hold the other person in the conversation. We honor what they have experienced in the conversation with us. Here's what it might look like. When you begin to explore someone else's intent. So you've impacted me, and I want to explore what your intentions were. Might sound like, so help me understand a little bit more what you meant by. Right? It might sound like, so I feel a little off in the conversation, and I think it's connected to what you said. Can we go back to that? When we want to get to the place of exploring your own impact, right? So exploring what your impact was on someone else. It seems my behavior had an impact on you. Now you might say, how are you supposed to know that? What percentage of communication is body language? Some ridiculous high number, right? So if you are actually attuned to the person that you're having a conversation with, you have an ability to read their body and know that what you just said landed on them in a way that's not so great. What were you feeling when? Okay. Now, to do this requires some vulnerability. To do this also requires admission that I may have done something wrong. How often are faculty wrong?
All the time.
It's a very real question, friends. We pay faculty and staff for your expertise, and we espouse perfection. Perfection is our enemy in these conversations. Vulnerability, trying on new behaviors, is our friend. What's the possibility for a solution here? What do you think we can do? What do you see as our next steps? Might it be possible to? Okay. I think the road here is paved by both folk being able to decide on what could come next. And this can happen across power lines too. So by power lines, I mean with students. Right? Student comes to you during office hours and say, I just feel like you never call on me. This is a student of color who's saying this to you, and you're white. I just feel like you never call on me. What would it look like for me to call on you? Which sounds like it's a silly question, right? That you just call on a person. No. You want that student's voice in So like, what would it look like? Would it look like me calling on you often? Like, because the ask there is probably connected to recognition, not just being called on, right? So if we stop at just the act of, we haven't gotten to something that's deeper, exploring that possibility with them. I could go on, but I'm not. Instead, I'm going to go on with some questions for you. And these are questions for you to sort of tickle your own thinking with. It could be for today. It could be well into the future. What I've offered you today are some ideas around how social identities matter in this conversation, how you might think about your own emotions entering the conversations, and giving more room to impact in the conversation. Again, all of which is framing. That's useful for every single one of these conversations, be it with other faculty members, department meeting,